folded steel swords are better, or are they? Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about folded steel swords. So in the Asian swords community, then there's this belief that a folded steel sword is better than an unfolded one. And today we're going to look at whether it's true or not. And so if we go back to ancient swordsmithing practices, then swords were folded, and folding the sword back then made it better. That's undeniable, and I'll go through the reasons for that. But we've got to ask, why were swords folded back then? And so we've got to go and look at the steel production. So they started with their iron ore, and in Asia generally magnetite in the form of iron sand was used. And magnetite is not a very good iron ore. It's a high iron percentage, but it doesn't form a nice slag, so the impurities don't come out nicely with it. So you start with your iron ore and you put it in your smelter and you melt that down, and you get two things. You get your slag, which is your impurities trapped in glass, and then you get your iron. And the impurities are usually silicon dioxide from sand, sulfur, phosphate, carbonates, and a few other trace stuff. Now about 25% of those impurities end up in your molten iron, your bloom. And so as this iron goes through, it melts through, and then in the Asian swordsmithing techniques, and they make it melt through charcoal, so it picks up carbon as it goes down. So you get iron plus carbon and you get steel. Now this steel is great, but it's got lots of impurities still in it. So here the folding serves two purposes. The first is because your bloom steel has these impurities, then you fold it, and as you fold it, then those impurities come to the surface, they get burnt up and they get removed, and so you end up with purer steel. And the second reason is because if you've got this iron that's melted through carbon, melted through charcoal to pick up its carbon, you don't have one block of steel that's got a set carbon content. Carbon's mixed throughout quite randomly. So what the smith does is he tests how much carbon is in there, and he sets aside high carbon, medium carbon, and low carbon bits of steel. But even within those, and there's a few differences. So you take that and then you fold it over on itself, and as you get these layers, then the layers become thinner and thinner, and you slowly homogenize the carbon content. So each bit comes closer to being one solid piece of steel with a set carbon content. And the reason why you do that is because if you have a sword and you have differences in carbon content going latitudinally, then you have weak points in your sword. Whereas what they do want is they want differences in the carbon content going longitudinally, so that you have a shock absorbing effect of the sword. And that's where you get your steel lamination, but let's not go into that. So what they want to do is they want to homogenize the carbon content first, so that they have these set pieces of steel with set carbon content, and then they can layer them nicely, rather than having a heterogeneous mixed up bits of carbon going, and then they try and forge a sword out of that, and then they realize, oh no, I've got these latitudinal bits of low carbon, and your sword breaks. The other thing is, going back onto the impurities, then impurities like phosphorus and sulfur, then in the quench, then they make the steel very hard, which seems like a good thing, but it actually makes these swords very brittle. And if you see records of Korean swordsmithing before, or in the mid-1500s, then they folded their steel 2 or 3 times. Compare this to Japanese swordsmithing, where they folded it 10, 15, 14 times around there. Then there's a big difference in the phosphorus and sulfur content, and there are records of Korean swords breaking on contact with Japanese swords. So it sounds really good. You get homogeneous carbon content, you get a stronger blade with lower impurities and all of that. So why doesn't that translate over to the same thing when you make modern steel folded swords? So I have here a wakizashi that I got at auction for my brother. It's a 1060 steel wakizashi with folded steel. And I bought it quite cheaply at this auction, but there are problems with it. And the problems come from the folding. So with folding in modern steel, then you start with a pure steel, low impurities, and the carbon content is homogenized. So we've already got to the end point of ancient steel folding techniques, what it was supposed to do. Does that mean the folding does nothing? No, folding actually creates problems with this steel. So when you fold it, then you create forge scale on the outer surface, and you try and get rid of as much of that as you can. But when you fold it, then some of that forge scale remains. And forge scale is Fe3O4, which is magnetite. It's a form of magnetite. And that's the iron ore that they started with back in the day. So you've gone back in the sequence, back to your starting product that you were trying to get rid of to make a pure steel. And as you fold that, then those get incorporated in. So you bring back impurities to the steel. The other thing that happens is that in modern forges, then unlike ancient forges where they use charcoal is pure carbon. It creates a very dry heat. They say it's a dry heat because it doesn't have water in it. It doesn't have hydrogen, so that when you burn that, it creates water. And so it prevents rusting and oxidation of the steel. In modern forges, then they use propane or natural gas, and that's a very wet heat. It promotes the oxidation, and it also promotes carbon content loss. So in pattern welding, then usually they have your steel, and then they have a high nickel steel to create the brights. So you get the contrast in the brights and the darks. Whereas in this sword here, then there are patterns, but there's no high nickel steel in it. The pattern actually comes from differences in carbon content. So you've got layers where they've got different carbon content, so then when they get etched, then they pop up differently. And so you have a loss of the carbon content. So you start with a higher carbon steel and you end up with a lower carbon steel. So you get a loss of that. And the thing is that when you look at ancient tamahagane, then they've done structural analysis of it. And it comes out to be about 0.70 to 0.80% carbon. So here you started with a lower carbon steel, a 1060 steel, and then you folded it and reduced it even more. So your folded steel is worse than your ancient quality swords. And finally is that you can add structural defects to it, because in the folding techniques, then sometimes you don't have a great smith, or there's air bubbles, or you don't get a complete weld of that fold completely shut. And so then you've gone from having a good solid steel to now having a steel that's maybe not so solid. Now that's with lower quality smiths, a lower quality production, but I bought this one quite cheaply, and it might have some of that. I'm not saying that folded steel swords are terrible, they're crap, you shouldn't buy that. I'm not saying that at all. Apart from if they have structural defects, which for any sword is a problem, then the swords will still cut, they will still function as swords. And it's not like they're completely terrible, you should avoid them like the plague. There's reasons for buying them, and that is that they look quite attractive. This one here has a really nice wood grain pattern on it, and it's the reason why I bought it. And so even if you end up with a lower carbon sword, then you've got lower carbon steel swords in a mono steel non-folded production, which still function fine. So the point is that you got to be aware of what you're getting. You're not getting a better sword, but you might buy it because of the aesthetic purposes, and that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So people think that if you buy a folded steel sword, then it will come out looking like a tamahagane blade, or a traditional Asian blade. And that's not true, because when you start with your bloom steel, then it's not homogeneous, so you get this much finer patterning of it. So where I would compare folded steel to looking like a wood grain, I personally think that tamahagane and traditional blades that are folded actually look more like a fabric weave, like a silk, with some grain and flow structure in there. And so it's definitely not the same aesthetic, but it is a nice aesthetic, I quite like it, and so it's not to say that you shouldn't buy a folded steel sword just because it looks pretty. So that's it for today's video. Folded steel swords aren't better, they do have their problems, but it's not wrong to buy them, and I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time.